Nobody expected to find a man lying motionless in the frost that morning, and certainly not like that. Not surrounded by 11 wild Mustangs, each one standing in absolute silence, as if frozen in time. It wasn't the man's injuries that left the search team speechless. It was the horses. They weren't grazing. They weren't milling about. They weren't afraid of the humans stumbling into their clearing. They were standing in a perfect crescent around the man, unmoving, unblinking, as though guarding something sacred. Their breath steamed into the cold air in soft bursts, the only movement in an otherwise unnerving stillness. No hoof shifted, no tail flicked, not even a snort to acknowledge the new arrivals. It was as if time had paused, and the entire scene had been set by something greater than instinct. And at the center of it all lay Jacob Turner, still, pale, and barely alive. Rosa Mendes, the local vet who had joined the search party, stopped dead in her tracks at the edge of the tree line. Her hand instinctively went to her mouth, but no sound came out. She had spent years observing wild Mustangs, and this was nothing like anything she'd seen before. These weren't domesticated animals reacting to a familiar handler. These were free-roaming horses, untouched, untamed, and typically skittish at the slightest human intrusion. But now, here they stood, arranged like sentries around a fallen soldier. Rosa took a cautious step forward, but the lead mare, a towering figure with a scarred foreleg and a thick black mane, turned her head slightly, not in fear, not in warning, but in acknowledgement. A glance, nothing more, yet it spoke volumes. For a long moment, no one moved. The deputies flanking Rosa exchanged glances, unsure whether to step closer or hold their ground. The tension was thick, humming through the air like static before a storm. Every rational instinct told them to proceed slowly to avoid spooking the animals, but every emotional instinct told them something else entirely. Don't interrupt this. Don't break whatever unspoken bond has formed here. They didn't understand it, and maybe they never would. But deep down, they knew they were witnessing something that didn't belong to the ordinary world. It felt like they had stepped into a story older than memory, one not written in books or captured in data, but passed down in quiet understanding between creatures who still remembered what it meant to trust without words. When they finally approached, moving inch by inch, the horses did not bolt. The mare's ears flicked, but she didn't move, nor did she protest when Rosa knelt beside the man. Only after Rosa whispered his name and reached out to feel for a pulse did the lead mare snort softly, the sound sharp in the still air, and the rest of the herd began to step back, not in fear, but with the calm precision of guards who had finished their shift. They moved slowly, deliberately, dispersing into the fog as if they had been summoned only for this one moment and no more. The last to go was the scarred mare. She stood a moment longer, her dark eyes fixed on Rosa, then turned and followed the others, vanishing into the mist like a ghost. Later, the team would ask questions that had no answers. Why didn't the horses run? Why had they surrounded Jacob so precisely? How did they find him in the first place, lying injured and helpless in a remote, frost-bitten clearing far from any well-trodden trail? There would be speculation, theories, even attempts to explain it away. But for those who were there, no explanation would ever feel adequate, because in that quiet clearing at dawn, they hadn't found just a man or a miracle of survival. They had found something else entirely, a moment so pure, so still, and so unexplainably right that it changed the way they looked at the wild, at nature, and at the fragile lines between us and the untamed world around us. And it all started with 11 horses, standing guard over a man who had no idea they were even there. Before Jacob Turner vanished into the frost-covered wild that morning, before his body was discovered lying still beneath a stand of wind-blown pines, he was just a quiet man living at the edge of nowhere. To the people of Silver Creek, he was more rumor than neighbor, a figure seen only in passing, a nod at the supply store, a man who appeared every other week to collect feed or fuel, then vanished again down that long dirt road into the basin. Some thought he liked the solitude, Others thought he feared what the world might try to take from him if he stayed too close to it. But the truth of Jacob Turner was far more complicated. Years earlier, long before Redwood Basin became his refuge, Jacob had worn a different kind of uniform. Military fatigues, combat boots, dust-streaked dog tags that clinked softly when he moved. He had served in regions that most people couldn't point to on a map, deserts so hot they shimmered, jungles so wet they swallowed sound. His records listed him as a medic, but the stories buried in his silence said more than any file could. Those who knew even a piece of his past said Jacob had seen too much, lost too many, and carried more than one lifetime's worth of ghosts. When he came back from his last deployment, there was no parade, no homecoming, just a handshake, a final order signed, and a man adrift. He didn't speak much of the war. When someone asked, his eyes would darken, and his responses would shrink to a few clipped words. It wasn't because he couldn't recall what happened, it was because he remembered too much. The boy whose life he couldn't save, the convoy that never made it back, the sound of rotors thudding in the night, blending with gunfire and the screams of people too young to understand what they were dying for. Jacob came home physically intact, but mentally scattered, like pieces of glass from a window that would never be whole again. He drifted for a while after that. Cities felt too loud. People talked too much. Noise and neon made his heart race for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't until he passed through Horizon Acres, just by chance, a detour taken on a road trip he hadn't planned, that something clicked. A for sale sign was tacked crookedly to a fence post beside an old collapsing cabin. The land was dry, wind-scoured and silent, and in that silence, Jacob felt something shift. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was the beginning of something like it. The kind of quiet that didn't press in or weigh heavy. The kind of quiet that left space for breath, for thought, for healing. He bought the property 2 weeks later. No fanfare, no farewell to wherever he'd come from. Just a cash sale, a set of rusty keys, and a life rewritten in isolation. Over time, Jacob rebuilt the cabin with his own hands, repaired the fences, dug out the old well. He didn't need much, just a stove, a generator for the coldest nights, a radio that barely worked, and a journal where he scribbled a line or two each evening. Observations more than thoughts. Wind from the north today. Coyote tracks by the creek. Snow likely tomorrow. And always he signed it the same way, just the date. No reflection, no emotion, just record-keeping for a life lived in the margins. But Jacob wasn't hiding from life, he was choosing his version of it. The wilderness didn't ask questions. It didn't care about what he'd done or failed to do. It didn't judge the way his hands sometimes trembled when a helicopter flew overhead or how he froze at the sound of fireworks echoing off canyon walls. It just existed, raw and unfiltered, and somehow that honesty was exactly what he needed. Every morning he hiked the same trail, the Beaver Run, a winding, uneven path that twisted through sagebrush and dry creek beds, climbing to rocky ridges with sweeping views of the basin. He liked the rhythm of it, the predictability, the way the land changed subtly with the seasons. He never brought a phone. He didn't trust them. Instead, he carried a small field radio, a folding knife, a set of battered binoculars, and his leather-bound journal. No more, no less. The essentials for someone who didn't want to be found, but still prepared for the worst. He saw the Mustangs often along those trails, always at a distance, sometimes a lone stallion watching him from atop a ridge, other times a mare leading her foal through a gap in the trees. They never approached him, but they didn't flee either. He respected that line, never crossing it, never trying to tame what was never his. And maybe that's why they never ran. Maybe they sensed something familiar in him, wounded, cautious, observant. A creature who had seen too much, who knew better than to intrude on something sacred. In time, he began to notice patterns. Certain horses that led, certain ones that lingered behind. One mare in particular, a large, commanding figure with a torn patch of hair over her foreleg, seemed to watch him more often than the others. He didn't name her, but he remembered her, page after page in his journal. Scarred mare sighted at the ridge again. Watched me for a long time today. And once, just once. Left apple on flat stone. Gone next morning. Hoofprint near the edge. That was all he wrote. He never told anyone, never tried it again. But in his mind, a wordless agreement had been made. Jacob Turner had built a life out of silence, routine, and distance. He wasn't lonely, though people might have assumed otherwise. He had chosen this path not to escape the world, but to find a different way to exist within it. And slowly, quietly, without fanfare, the land accepted him. So did its creatures. And perhaps, without him even realizing it, so did the wild horses who had roamed these lands long before he ever arrived. What he didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that everything he had quietly built, everything he had come to rely on, was about to be tested in a way no amount of solitude could prepare him for. That morning began like so many others before it, the air brittle with cold, the light of dawn barely a whisper along the horizon. Jacob Turner stepped outside his cabin, boots crunching over a thin crust of frost that had settled in the night. The sky was streaked with a faint wash of pink, a promise of morning still wrapped in the remnants of night. His breath curled in the air, slow and deliberate, matching the pace of his movements. This wasn't a morning for rushing. It was the kind of cold that warned of slick trails, hidden ice, and unexpected shifts in terrain. Jacob knew better than most how the land could turn on you when your focus slipped. He moved with practiced ease, layers wrapped tight, journal tucked into his coat, binoculars slung across his chest. The small radio, scratched and stubborn, was clipped to his belt. He didn't expect to use it, but he always brought it, habit born from years of carrying gear he hoped he wouldn't need. As he crossed the yard and stepped onto the trail leading away from the cabin, he paused briefly, glancing back at the modest structure that had become his shelter from the world. The woodpile was stacked, the stove still warm from the fire he'd banked the night before. Everything in its place. The Beaver Run Trail welcomed him like an old friend, its winding path familiar underfoot despite the frost. Each bend, each stretch of gravel or exposed route, he had walked 100 times or more. The quiet was complete except for the occasional rustle of wind through brittle grass and the low creak of trees adjusting to the cold. His destination was Granite Point, a narrow ridge that jutted out over a patch of dense forest below. It was a place of harsh beauty, prone to erosion, often unstable in winter. But Jacob made regular checks there, noting new rockfalls, changes in the soil, anything that might pose a threat to wildlife, or to the rare hiker who wandered too far off trail. It wasn't obligation that drove him to go, it was respect. The land had given him space to breathe, and he returned the favor in quiet stewardship. As he walked, he noticed the frost was thicker than usual. Not the powdery kind that brushed off with a boot, but a dense glassy sheen that coated the rocks like a layer of invisible oil. He adjusted his pace, treading more carefully, scanning for signs of shifting ground. In the trees ahead, the outline of Granite Point began to emerge, stark against the paling sky. He could see the faint reddish hue of iron-rich soil, the jagged edges of broken rock where time and wind had worn away the ridge. He took a moment to study the terrain, noting the slope, the angle of descent if something gave way. It wasn't fear that made him cautious. It was memory. In war, he'd learned that the ground beneath you wasn't always safe, and the things you couldn't see were often the most dangerous. As he neared the ridge, a quiet alertness settled into him, a kind of instinct honed over years of both combat and survival. He crouched briefly near a patch of disturbed dirt, running his fingers along the edge, a faint impression. Hoof marks, fresh, maybe a few hours old at most. The Mustangs had passed through here, perhaps even the scarred mare. He straightened slowly, allowing himself a flicker of thought that she might be nearby, just out of sight, watching as she often did. He made a mental note, then stepped forward. That was when it happened. His boot met the surface of a flat rock, one he'd crossed dozens of times before, and it slid. Not much, just enough, a shift of centimeters, but on frost-glazed stone, that was all it took. The ground beneath him betrayed its own stillness, the layer of ice cracking like a brittle shell. A muted crunch, a split second of weightlessness. Then gravity claimed him. Jacob's instincts kicked in, but there was no time. He reached for something, anything, but his gloved hand scraped against nothing but cold air. The stone gave way completely, a thin crust of frozen dirt cascading with it, and his body lurched sideways, hitting the exposed edge of a buried boulder with a jarring thud. Pain exploded in his shoulder, white-hot and electric, stealing his breath. He tumbled further, bounced, rolled. The world turned to blur and silence and motion. When he finally came to a halt, it was in a tangled nest of roots and frozen grass, wedged between two pines that stood like silent sentries over his broken form. For a long time he didn't move, couldn't. The pain in his shoulder was sharp, radiating up his neck and down his back. His right side felt wrong, disjointed and raw. He tried to breathe, but each inhale came shallow, tight. The cold crept in fast, wicking through the layers of his clothing, pulling warmth from his skin. His vision doubled, blurred, then steadied. Above him, the branches swayed gently, coated in frost, brushing against a sky now pale with morning light. He reached for the radio. Nothing. The fall had bent the antenna and knocked the device loose from its clip. It lay half buried in the dirt a few feet away, useless. He blinked against the dizziness, tried to focus, but the world tilted, and the throbbing in his head drowned out rational thought. He didn't know how long he lay there. Minutes, hours. Time lost its shape. The frost began to melt into his clothes, sending waves of chill deeper into his body. He drifted in and out of awareness, the edges of his mind fraying. Memory slipped in. The desert, the heat, a comrade's blood pooling in sand. The roar of distant fire. Then a whisper of sound, impossibly close. The shift of grass. A slow exhale of warm breath. Not wind, not human. A shadow passed near him. 4 legs, no voice, no words, just presence. And then, nothing again. The darkness returned. He didn't fight it this time. Somewhere in the fog of his mind, one final thought rose to the surface. Not fear, not regret, just the quiet resignation of a man who had seen the end before. Only this time, it wasn't accompanied by the flash of gunfire or the scream of engines. It came with the soft rhythm of hooves and the hush of wild things moving in the cold. By the time Gerald Harrison's old pickup truck rolled up the narrow, dusty track leading to Jacob Turner's cabin, the morning sun had already begun its slow climb above the eastern ridge. A bitter wind chased dust along the fence line, carrying with it a silence too sharp for comfort. Gerald shifted in his seat, one hand gripping the wheel, the other clutching a paper bag filled with groceries, canned goods, dried beans, a loaf of bread wrapped in butcher paper. A routine gesture. He made this delivery every week like clockwork, never questioned, never missed. It was the kind of quiet agreement formed between men who understood each other without needing to explain why. When he reached the cabin, something didn't sit right. The place looked still. Too still. There was no smoke curling from the chimney, no sign of movement beyond the thin curtains drawn across the windows. The porch steps, usually swept clear, held a dusting of frost that hadn't been disturbed. Gerald put the truck in park, stepped out, and stood for a moment, peering toward the door. "Jacob!" he called, voice carrying just enough to reach the woods beyond the clearing. Nothing. No echo. No movement. A strange tightness gripped his chest as he climbed the steps and knocked twice against the frame. Still no answer. With a sense of unease growing sharper by the second, Gerald reached for the knob, unlocked. That wasn't like Jacob. He pushed the door open, hesitated, then stepped inside. The cabin's interior was neat, too neat. The bed was made with crisp military corners, the stove cold, its last fire long since burned out. On the table, a coffee mug sat untouched, a ring of dried liquid marking the surface beneath it. His coat still hung over the back of a chair. Jacob hadn't meant to be gone long. Gerald stood there a moment, staring at the empty space as a chill worked its way up his spine. He'd known Jacob for years, knew the man didn't disappear without reason. Something had happened. Without wasting another second, Gerald stepped outside, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his cell phone. An old flip model that barely held a charge, but today it worked. He dialed the direct line to Chief Robert Palmer, the man who had been both lawman and friend to this corner of the world for over 2 decades. "Chief, it's Gerald," he said as soon as the line picked up. "I'm out at Jacob's. He's not here. Cabin's cold. Looks like he went out early, but it's been too long." On the other end of the line, Palmer's voice hardened. "When was the last time you saw him?" "Last week, same time. We don't talk much, but he's always here. Always." A pause. "I'll meet you there," the chief said. "Don't go looking on your own." "I won't," Gerald replied, though his eyes had already wandered toward the trail Jacob often used, the one that vanished into the woods like a forgotten memory. By the time Palmer arrived, his cruiser crunching up the gravel, lights off, but urgency pulsing from the way he moved, Gerald had already gathered Jacob's radio, his field pack, and the worn map from the wall, traced with pencil lines marking every trail and ridge Jacob had walked. They pored over the notes, found the most likely path. "Granite Point," Gerald said, tapping the spot circled in faded red ink. "He's been keeping an eye on this area." Palmer narrowed his gaze. "That trail's barely passable in winter. If he went there with the frost down—" "He knew the risks," Gerald replied. "But he wouldn't have stayed out this long without sending word." "We're going to need help," Palmer said, already turning to call in 2 deputies and a rescue medic. He moved fast, old instincts kicking in, the kind honed from too many search and rescue calls in these hills. Within the hour, the plan was set. They would go in light and fast, following Jacob's likely route. A medic, Rosa Mendez, the local veterinarian with years of field experience, volunteered to join. She knew the land, but more importantly, she knew Jacob, knew the kind of man he was, which meant she also knew that something serious had happened. By the time they left the cabin, a hush had settled over Horizon Acres, the kind of silence that comes before a storm, or just after one, when the world holds its breath and waits to see what's left behind. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the distant calls of ravens tracing circles in the sky. As the rescue team disappeared into the forest, following the trail worn into the frost by a solitary man, the land itself seemed to close in behind them, like a secret reluctant to give up its truth. The frost bit deeper the higher Jacob climbed, the wind clawing through the folds of his jacket like invisible fingers searching for weakness. The trail, barely visible in the early dawn light, wound like a thin scar along the face of the ridge, bordered on one side by a drop that plunged into a stand of twisted pine, and on the other by boulders stacked as if a giant had carelessly tossed them there centuries ago. He knew this path well. He had walked it in summer when the heat baked the rock underfoot, and in fall when leaves turned copper and whispered like paper under his boots. But today it was different. The land was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was too still, too watchful. Jacob could feel it in the prickle at the back of his neck, the way the crows weren't calling, the way the trees held their breath. He tightened his grip on the small pack slung over one shoulder. It held the essentials: binoculars, a first aid pouch, a radio that crackled weakly with static, and his leather-bound journal that rarely left his side. He didn't write in it often, just simple observations, weather notes, movement patterns of the Mustangs, but it grounded him. Some men carried weapons. Jacob carried pages filled with silence. He reached a bend in the trail where the earth opened to a wide, sloping shelf known locally as Granite Point. The overlook gave a commanding view of the valley below, but it was dangerous, loose shale underfoot, rimmed with frost, the kind of terrain that gave no second chances. Jacob knelt, tested the ground, fingers brushing aside the thin white crust. It held, for now. He adjusted his footing, stepping forward with the kind of caution that had been drilled into him during patrols in distant war zones. Each placement of his boots was deliberate, no wasted motion, no risk uncalculated. As he reached the outermost edge of the point, he spotted fresh signs, not human, hoof marks, broad, rounded, clean impressions pressed into the frost-softened earth. He crouched, brushing his fingers along one. It was deep, recently made. The herd had passed through here, 11 of them by his last count. He'd seen them a week ago near the southern ridge, strong animals with glossy coats, their movements smooth and unified like the pulse of a single living thing. But what caught his attention now wasn't just the tracks, it was the positioning. They were clustered, too close together for casual passage, as if they had stopped here, stood here, watched something, or waited. Jacob rose slowly, turned his eyes to the horizon. The air was crisp, sharpening his breath into brief clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. He shifted his weight, just slightly, and that was enough. The ground beneath his boot gave way with a sudden crunch, the thin crust of frost splitting like glass. He threw his weight backward instinctively, but the slab of rock he'd been standing on didn't care about instincts. It slid, fast and final, carrying him with it. The fall was not long, but it was brutal. Jacob's shoulder caught first on an outcropping, jerking his body sideways before he tumbled over it, crashing through a mat of brambles and loose dirt. His pack was torn from him, the radio flung somewhere into the underbrush. He landed hard in a hollow between two trees. The wind punched from his lungs, his body jarred into silence. The world spun, colors bleeding into one another as his vision shrank to a tunnel of sky and trembling branches. He tried to breathe, but his ribs ached with the effort. Tried to sit up, but white-hot pain lanced through his right arm. Something was wrong. Dislocated maybe worse. Time blurred after that. The sky shifted from grey to silver, then back again. His breath turned shallow. Cold seeped into him through the damp earth, curling around his spine, settling into the hollow beneath his heart. The edges of his thoughts began to fray. Sounds came and went, twigs cracking, wind sighing, something heavier than wind pressing softly into the dirt nearby. He wasn't alone. But when he tried to lift his head, the world dissolved into spots of light and dark, and then into nothing at all. Jacob drifted in and out of awareness, caught in a strange half-dream where memories tangled with the present. He was in the desert again, the heat so strong it shimmered. Then he was on a jungle path, sounds foreign and thick all around him. Then the cold pulled him back, harsh and immediate. He felt his body shiver, involuntarily now, the last defense against the creeping numbness. Somewhere in that silence, he heard the unmistakable sound of breath, not his own, deep, rhythmic, steady, and close. He wanted to turn his head to see what was there, but it was like trying to move underwater. Still, he knew, somehow, without seeing, he knew, they were there. The horses. He couldn't say how he knew. It wasn't a sound exactly. It wasn't the warmth that seemed to press against his side, warding off the worst of the cold. It wasn't even the gentle thud of hooves on frozen ground. It was something deeper, a presence, a weight in the air, like a heartbeat just outside his own body. He surrendered to it, not out of fear or helplessness, but because it felt safe, as though the land had wrapped itself around him and decided he wasn't to be lost. Not yet. The last thing he saw before the dark finally took him was a silhouette, large, quiet, still. A horse watching him, not moving, just there. And in some strange, inexplicable way, he felt a wordless promise pass between them, held in the frozen silence of that winter morning. You are not alone. When the search team reached the lower ridge, trudging carefully through a mix of brittle frost and uneven ground, they didn't know what they expected to find. Maybe Jacob injured, maybe lost, maybe worse. What they certainly didn't expect was silence, profound, absolute silence, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Rosa Mendez was the first to spot the clearing below, her sharp eyes catching the subtle break in vegetation and the imprint of disrupted snow and crushed grass. She held up a hand to halt the deputies following behind her. "There," she whispered, pointing. "Something's down there." As they moved cautiously forward, descending the slope with boots slipping slightly in the loose soil, the image unfolded before them, impossible at first, then unmistakably clear. Jacob Turner lay motionless in the grass, his body partially covered in snowmelt, jacket darkened with dampness, his face pale, lips tinged blue. But what stopped Rosa in her tracks wasn't his condition, though it was alarming. It was the sight around him. 11 Mustangs, wild and free, standing in a perfect crescent shape, their bodies still as statues, their heads low, breath misting gently into the cold morning air. They did not flee at the human presence. They did not stir. It was as if they had chosen to be there, chosen to stay. At the center of them stood a mare, taller than the others, thick-necked and sturdy, her dark mane tangled across one side of her face. Rosa's breath caught as she noticed a faint scar running down the mare's front right leg, partially obscured by longer, uneven fur, an old wound, healed long ago, but still visible. The mare didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on Jacob, and when Rosa dared to inch closer, she noticed the mare subtly shift, one deliberate step to place herself more squarely between Jacob and the approaching humans. One of the deputies behind Rosa inhaled sharply and muttered, "Should we?" But Chief Palmer silenced him with a single raised hand and a narrowed look. Rosa crouched low, slowly, trying not to disturb the fragile energy that hung over the clearing like a spiderweb. "Jacob," she said softly, her voice catching in the back of her throat. "Jacob, we're here." No response. She saw the slow rise and fall of his chest, faint but steady, a small mercy. He was alive. The tension was palpable, humming through the cold air like a current. Any sudden movement could scatter the herd or worse, provoke a defensive reaction. These were wild animals, after all, unpredictable, powerful, and untamed. And yet they remained still. Their ears twitched, their flanks occasionally shifting as steam rose from their bodies into the freezing morning light, but otherwise they stood like sentinels, guardians. The younger Mustangs were especially intriguing. One, smaller than the rest and more nervous, took a few tentative steps toward Jacob, head lowered, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Before it could reach him, the scarred mare flicked her ears and issued a low, breathy snort. The young horse stopped, hesitated, then retreated quietly. No bridles, no halters, no ropes, yet the entire herd moved as one, answering to signals barely perceptible to human eyes. Rosa had seen horses all her life, had studied their social patterns, worked with them in rescue and rehabilitation. She'd seen their loyalty to one another, their protective instincts toward foals, but never, not once, had she seen anything like this. She reached into her jacket pocket for a radio, carefully, trying not to draw the attention of the lead mare. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, and she lifted the receiver to her lips. "This is Rosa Mendez. We've located Jacob Turner. He's alive, but you need to send a med team immediately." She hesitated. "And you won't believe what's here with him." The mare blinked, slow and calm. Then, in an almost imperceptible shift, she released a sharp exhale through her nostrils, a single loud snort that sliced through the silence. It was as if that sound had been a cue. One by one, the Mustangs began to move, not chaotically, not with fear. They walked, slowly, deliberately. They peeled away from the circle, stepping around each other with quiet grace. Their hooves made soft thuds against the damp ground. Not one of them bolted, not one of them broke into a run. They simply withdrew, as if their watch was over, all except the lead mare. She lingered, standing just a few feet from Jacob, watching him with an intensity that made Rosa's skin prickle. Then she turned her head, glanced once at the humans standing just outside the ring of trees, and walked into the fog beyond the clearing, disappearing like a ghost fading into morning mist. Rosa exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She rushed to Jacob's side, her hands already moving with practiced efficiency, checking pulse, examining injuries, noting the crusted blood at his temple, the unnatural angle of his shoulder. "He's hypothermic," she muttered, "and this arm's out of socket, or worse." She looked to the deputies. "Help me stabilize him." They moved in quickly now that the Mustangs were gone, unfolding a stretcher, unspooling ropes to create a makeshift hauling system. Every few seconds, Rosa glanced toward the trees, half expecting the horses to reappear, though they didn't. The clearing was just a clearing now. Ordinary, quiet, except for Jacob's shallow breaths and the whispered awe in the voices of the rescuers. One of the deputies, a younger man with disbelief painted across his face, asked softly, "What do you think that was?" Chief Palmer, grim and practical, didn't answer right away. Then he said simply, "They were standing guard." Jacob stirred slightly as they loaded him onto the stretcher. His eyelids fluttered. Rosa leaned close, grasping his hand gently. "Jacob, it's Rosa. You're okay now. We've got you." His lips parted. A whisper escaped, almost too faint to hear. "They stayed." She froze. "What? What did you say?" He blinked slowly. "The horses. They stayed. With me." Then he slipped back into unconsciousness. As the med team arrived and took over, Rosa stood for a long moment, looking back toward the fog. The image wouldn't leave her. The crescent of Mustangs, the unwavering stance of the mare, the unblinking eyes fixed on Jacob as if he were one of their own. She had no explanation, and yet she had no doubt. Whatever had occurred in that silent, frozen clearing wasn't instinct. It wasn't coincidence. It was something else, something that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The rescue was only the beginning. Word spread fast in Silver Creek, faster than anyone could have expected. By the time Jacob Turner was loaded into the emergency vehicle and whisked toward the nearest hospital, whispers were already rippling across town, carried through crackling radio chatter, murmured over steaming mugs of coffee, passed from neighbor to neighbor with the same reverence usually reserved for sacred news. Not just that he'd been found, not just that he was alive, but how he'd been found, alone, unconscious, in the middle of a frost-covered clearing, and surrounded by 11 wild Mustangs, not fleeing from him, not startled by his presence, but standing around him, guarding him. Rosa Mendez returned to the hospital as the medics worked, her hands raw from the cold and her thoughts spinning. It was too soon for explanations. Jacob had slipped back into unconsciousness after murmuring about the horses, and though his vitals had stabilized, his condition was still precarious. Mild hypothermia, a dislocated shoulder, a concussion, and superficial frostbite along his fingers and ears. He looked fragile now, in a way that unsettled Rosa. This was a man built for survival, one who had faced down war, hardship, isolation. Yet in that moment, in that sterile hospital bed, he seemed smaller, more human. Rosa wasn't alone in her unease. Chief Palmer had been silent for most of the drive back, his jaw set, his mind clearly working overtime. Once back in Silver Creek, he wasted no time gathering his team, instructing them to record every detail, Jacob's last known location, the trail conditions, the weather patterns, and, most critically, the behavior of the Mustangs. It wasn't protocol. It was curiosity, yes, but also a sense that this was something bigger than routine search and rescue. Palmer had spent decades in law enforcement. He knew when facts didn't line up, when instincts whispered there was more beneath the surface. At the hospital, Rosa hovered. She sat in the waiting room flipping through a veterinary journal she wasn't reading, her mind drifting back to the image of the scarred mare standing so still, so alert, as if fulfilling an oath only she understood. The others had followed her lead, responding to subtle cues, shifting together like wind through tall grass. Rosa had seen domesticated horses react to danger, sure. She'd seen loyalty, alertness, protectiveness, but this wasn't the same. Wild horses didn't stay with humans. They didn't stand sentinel over a fallen man in the cold. They didn't form circles around the injured, and they certainly didn't linger until help arrived. Dr. Natalie Weber emerged from Jacob's room just after noon, peeling off her gloves and rubbing her temples. "Stable," she told Rosa. "We've set the shoulder, no internal bleeding. He'll be sore, disoriented and tired for a few days, but he's going to pull through." Rosa exhaled, the tension in her shoulders finally easing, but Dr. Weber wasn't finished. And whatever he was doing out there, it's a miracle he survived the night in that condition, especially alone. She hesitated, watching Rosa. Except, he wasn't alone, was he? Rosa looked up. "No," she said quietly, "he wasn't." The next morning, Silver Creek's small-town newspaper ran a front-page story that left many residents wide-eyed and silent. 11 Mustangs stand guard over fallen rancher, the headline read. A blurry photo taken by one of the deputies with a zoom lens from the ridge showed Jacob's limp form barely visible amid the dark shapes of horses. By mid-afternoon, it had gone viral. Blogs picked it up. Regional news outlets started calling. People showed up at the edge of the preserve hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle herd. Rosa tried to shield Jacob from the attention, speaking to Dr. Weber about limiting access and keeping visitors at bay. Palmer stepped in too, managing the media with his usual no-nonsense approach. But the story had taken on a life of its own, morphing from a survival account into something mythic. People didn't just want the facts, they wanted meaning. They wanted to believe. Jacob finally woke fully 2 days later. Rosa was in the room when he opened his eyes, groggy and confused, but lucid enough to recognize her. "You," he croaked, his throat dry. "You were there." Rosa smiled and handed him a glass of water. "We all were," she said, "but they got there first." He blinked slowly, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. "They didn't leave me," he whispered. "I remember their breath. It was warm, the wind stopped, and I could hear them breathing. That's all that kept me tethered." For a while, neither of them spoke. Outside the hospital window, the sky was a soft winter gray, snow flurries drifting down like whispers. Then Jacob asked the question he couldn't shake. Why did they stay? Rosa didn't have an answer. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," she said slowly, "but that wasn't instinct. It was something else." She thought of the scarred mare, her eyes sharp and calm. Maybe they knew you, maybe not as a person, but as something familiar, something worth protecting. Later that day, Palmer arrived with Dr. Sanders in tow, a wildlife behaviorist Rosa had called in quietly after the second wave of media coverage. Sanders was sharp, curious, and methodical, but even he struggled to explain what the reports and trail cams were showing. The Mustangs hadn't disappeared. They were still in the preserve, but something had shifted. They were moving differently, using new paths, remaining closer to areas near the ridge. And trail cam footage showed the scarred mare returning twice to the edge of the clearing where Jacob had fallen, standing for several minutes before retreating again. Almost like she was checking. Sanders wanted to meet Jacob, wanted to talk to him, to learn what he remembered. Jacob wasn't ready yet, not to talk, not to explain, and certainly not to be turned into someone else's case study. So Rosa asked the questions gently, drawing out what she could. Yes, he had seen the mare before, often in fact, from a distance. No, he'd never fed her, never approached, but he'd always noticed her, had once helped a young foal caught in a muddy ditch. Maybe that foal had belonged to her, maybe she remembered. By the end of the week, the media had dubbed the story the Mustang Miracle. But for Rosa and for Jacob, that name didn't do it justice. It wasn't a miracle, not exactly. It was a moment, a recognition, a pause in the great indifferent rhythm of the wild, where one species had chosen, just for a while, to stand still for another. And in that pause, something had changed. Rosa stood at the edge of the clearing with her hands buried deep in her jacket pockets, the late afternoon wind curling around her collar and lifting strands of her hair. The snow had started to melt in patches, revealing damp earth beneath and leaving behind little pockets of slush that glittered like scattered gems in the low winter light. It had been several weeks since Jacob's rescue, and though the media storm had begun to settle, the questions hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd only grown more persistent. Scientists were intrigued, the public was enchanted, and a small but vocal group of skeptics had started poking holes in the narrative, calling it nothing more than coincidence wrapped in folklore. But none of that mattered to Rosa. She hadn't come out here for answers. She came to see the place again with her own eyes, the place where something inexplicable had unfolded in the hush of a frost-covered dawn. The exact spot where Jacob had lain was easy to find. The pines still bore faint signs of human presence: slightly trampled grass, a twisted bit of gauze caught on a low branch, the indentation in the earth that hadn't fully risen since the stretcher had been lifted away. But the most remarkable detail was more subtle. A ring of hoofprints still lingered, not in full form, but in ghostly impressions. Not scattered randomly like a stampede, but carefully placed, a circle of guardianship, deliberate and symmetrical. Rosa knelt down and pressed her palm to one of them. The ground was cold and soft, but the imprint was still defined. This wasn't a story. It was evidence if anyone cared to look beyond disbelief. Behind her, the faint sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. She turned to see Dr. Matthew Sanders navigating the slope behind the clearing, his messenger bag slung over one shoulder and a notebook clutched in his gloved hand. He gave a polite nod as he reached her side. "Thought I might find you here," he said, his breath visible in the chilly air. Rosa nodded. "Did you bring the trail cam footage?" Sanders didn't reply right away. Instead, he pulled a tablet from his bag and tapped the screen, bringing up a sequence of black and white stills. He handed it to her silently. The images were grainy, but unmistakable. A time-stamped progression of the 11 Mustangs returning to this very clearing 3 nights after Jacob had been taken to the hospital. First the scarred mare, then the others, filing in like sentinels returning to a post. They didn't mill around aimlessly. They didn't graze. They stood and waited. For what? Neither Rosa nor Sanders could say. After 23 minutes, the herd turned and departed again, as calmly as they'd arrived. Rosa handed the tablet back slowly, still absorbing the gravity of what she'd seen. "They came back," she murmured. "That's the 3rd time since he was rescued." Sanders nodded. "I've tracked wild horse behavior for over 15 years. I've never seen this kind of repeated return to a single spot, especially not one associated with human presence." He glanced around the clearing, eyes narrowing. "It's as if they're checking on it, or perhaps waiting." The word lingered between them, heavy with possibility. Waiting. But for what? That evening, Rosa visited Jacob again. He was still recovering at home, slower than he liked, restless and trying not to show it. He met her at the porch, one arm in a sling, his other hand holding a steaming mug of coffee. "You've been out there," he said simply, not as a question but a statement. She nodded. "They came back. The Mustangs, 3 nights ago." Jacob didn't look surprised. He sipped his coffee, staring out toward the eastern ridge where the land began to rise in uneven waves. "I've been hearing them," he said after a moment. "Not close, but out there. The way they move, it's like they're following old patterns. Only now those patterns have shifted a little, like they've carved out new paths." Rosa stepped up beside him. "The cams show them circling the clearing where we found you. Not every night, just occasionally. As if, I don't know, they're remembering it." Jacob didn't speak. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was listening. He had always listened more than he spoke, but now that listening had taken on a new weight, the kind born from experience that couldn't be rationalized away. Later that night, Jacob opened the small leather-bound journal he kept on his bedside table. He wrote only a few words, as was his habit. "They remember, still watching." It was enough. He didn't need paragraphs to capture meaning anymore. He had learned in those frozen hours of near death and equine vigil that some truths were better left simple. Some connections couldn't be explained in academic language or televised reports. They were felt in silence, in stillness, in shared breath on a frozen morning. In the weeks that followed, the town of Silver Creek buzzed with opinions. Gerald Harrison swore that the herd had changed its migration path and now passed within view of his ranch twice a week. Another neighbor claimed to have spotted the scarred mare standing atop a hill overlooking Jacob's cabin just after dawn, unmoving like a statue. Whether these accounts were true or shaped by the power of suggestion didn't matter anymore. The town had already decided what it believed, and belief, once rooted, has a way of turning into legend. What set this story apart wasn't just the facts, it was the atmosphere surrounding them. The quiet unity of the horses, the unexplainable return, the consistency with which the scarred mare led her herd, as if responding not to instinct, but to something more layered. Every time Rosa looked at those trail cam images, her chest tightened with something she hadn't felt since she was a child, crouched in haylofts, watching foals take their first unsteady steps. Reverence, that old, unspoken feeling that nature didn't just function, it chose, that in rare moments it could see us. And maybe that's what haunted her most, not the science she couldn't explain, but the possibility that what she'd witnessed wasn't a miracle or a mystery. It was a moment of recognition, something deeply ancient that bypassed language and bled into the roots of being. Human or horse, it didn't matter. Something had passed between Jacob and the Mustangs, not pity, not confusion, but understanding. And that changed everything. Jacob stood at the crest of the ridge, the wind tugging gently at the sleeves of his weathered coat as the first rays of sunrise painted the sky in muted golds and pale pinks. Below him, the canyon opened like a secret too long kept, quiet, jagged, immense. It had taken him nearly 2 hours of cautious hiking to reach this spot, his healing shoulder a constant, dull throb of protest with each careful step. But pain wasn't a deterrent. It was simply part of the process, a reminder that he was still here, still breathing, still able to return to the place where everything had changed. He scanned the canyon floor, his eyes adjusting to the soft morning light. There, movement. At first, just a flicker, a shape shifting through the brush, then another. It wasn't long before the entire herd came into view, emerging slowly from between the narrow canyon walls, their movements deliberate, their pace unhurried. 11 Mustangs, each one distinct in form and color. At the center of them, the scarred mare led without question, her steps sure-footed, her eyes constantly sweeping the terrain ahead. They were moving with purpose again, not like startled animals driven by fear, but as a unit guided by intention. Jacob felt his breath catch. They hadn't just survived, they were thriving. He crouched behind a low outcrop of rock, resting against it as he watched. The young grey colt, barely more than a yearling now, stayed close to a copper-toned mare with a white blaze, likely his mother. He moved with a wild, playful energy, nipping at the tails of older herd members, darting ahead before returning to the fold. Jacob smiled faintly. There was something reassuring about seeing that youth and mischief could still exist in a world that had once seemed like it held only silence and loss. In the weeks since the roundup had been suspended, the herd had retreated deeper into the canyon system, navigating steep slopes, fording icy creeks, and finding shelter in places even experienced trackers avoided. Their ability to adapt was nothing short of remarkable. Dr. Sanders had called it unprecedented. Rosa had called it instinct with a memory. But Jacob knew it was more. He had felt it the night he'd held up the flare. The tension in the air, the stare of the scarred mare, the moment when they didn't just react, but responded. He'd since made a habit of visiting the canyon from time to time, never pressing too close, never forcing his presence. If they saw him, they never showed signs of fear. Sometimes the scarred mare would lift her head and look in his direction, not startled, not alarmed, just aware. That quiet awareness had become the cornerstone of something unspoken between them. They didn't need anything more. Today, though, something felt different. The herd slowed near a cluster of twisted junipers and began to graze, but the scarred mare did not follow suit. She stood slightly apart, head raised, her body still. She turned, ever so slightly, and fixed her gaze on the ridge where Jacob crouched. He didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. She stared for a long moment, long enough for him to feel the weight of it, like a question posed without words. Then, with no signal that he could see, she turned back toward the herd and gave a low, breathy nicker. The rest of the Mustangs lifted their heads. As one, they began to move again, but this time they weren't wandering or grazing. They were walking uphill toward the pass that led back to the basin. It was the first time Jacob had seen them leave the canyons since the night of the flare. He shifted his weight and stood slowly, watching with growing tension as the herd gained elevation. By the time they reached the first plateau, the air had grown sharper, the morning light now strong enough to cast shadows beneath their hooves. They paused there, all of them, clustered together, their bodies still as stone. Then the scarred mare turned again, this time toward the cabin. Jacob turned instinctively to follow her line of sight. Horizon acres. Even from this distance, he could make out the faint glint of sunlight off the tin roof. A column of smoke rose lazily from the chimney. Someone was there, probably Gerald, stopping by to feed the chickens or restock the woodpile, as he often did when Jacob went on his walks. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the rustle of wind through the trees, but Jacob knew it too well, the thudding rhythm of rotors cutting through still air. A helicopter. Another one followed within seconds, and then another. The sound grew louder, bouncing off canyon walls, making the earth seem to vibrate beneath his feet. His heart slammed against his ribs. Number not again. He dropped to his knees and fumbled through his pack, pulling out the small field radio Rosa had given him. Not the short-range model, but the one with direct access to the sheriff's office and park rangers. Static hissed, then cleared. He pressed the button and spoke. "This is Turner," he said, breathless. "They're back. Helicopters, over the western range. You copy?" A pause. Then Chief Palmer's voice, sharp and controlled. "We see them, not ours. Nevada base confirms no authorized flyovers scheduled. Could be private." Jacob swore under his breath and shoved the radio back in his pack. Unauthorized, which meant whoever was flying those birds wasn't just sightseeing. They were looking for something, or someone. Maybe the story had traveled too far, drawn too much attention. The sanctuary decision hadn't been made official yet. Until it was, the herd was still vulnerable. He looked back down the ridge. The Mustangs were already reacting, their bodies tense, ears flicking. The scarred mare stepped forward, eyes scanning the sky. She let out a sharp whinny, not fear, but warning. The herd tightened its formation, younger horses moving toward the center, older ones flanking. It was the same response they'd shown weeks ago, not panic, organization. And then, as if cued by some ancient rhythm, they began to move, not away, not blindly, but toward the lower ravines. A route Jacob recognized immediately. It would take them deeper into the canyon system, through crevices too narrow for aircraft and away from open terrain. He couldn't help but feel awe as he watched. They remembered. He grabbed his pack and descended fast, ignoring the flare of pain in his shoulder. The trail was rough, but he knew it by heart. Every rock, every drop-off. He wasn't going to catch up with the herd. He didn't need to. He just needed to reach the halfway point, where the canyon split, and ensure the way was clear. If any of the routes were blocked by fallen trees or rock slides, the Mustangs would be trapped. By the time he reached the junction, the noise of the helicopters had faded slightly. Maybe they'd given up, or maybe they were circling back to report. He dropped to one knee, scanned the path, and let out a breath of relief. The way was open. Then came the sound of hooves. From the left, the herd emerged, led by the mare, her chest heaving, her stride steady. She slowed just enough to pass within arm's reach of Jacob. For one suspended moment, they locked eyes. Her body glistened with exertion, but her gaze was calm, grounded. He didn't speak, he didn't move. She blinked once, then passed by. The rest of the herd followed, silent save for the rhythm of their hooves and the wind through the canyon. Within seconds, they vanished into the narrowing gorge, swallowed by stone and shadow. Jacob remained kneeling for a long time, heart pounding, chest tight with something too vast to name. Not fear, not even relief, just the overwhelming truth of connection, not imagined, not wished for, but real. He pulled out his journal, just 3 words, written with a shaking hand. They chose safety. And this time, they didn't need his help. They already knew the way. The storm came without warning, not the kind that rolls in with distant thunder and a shifting sky, but the kind that arrives suddenly, like a curtain being pulled across the horizon, fast, heavy, and absolute. One moment the light was golden, slanting through the branches with the promise of another calm evening. The next, it had darkened to a strange, metallic hue, the air electric, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Jacob was already at the basin that day, inspecting the new fencing Rosa and the volunteers had helped install. Not to contain the Mustangs, but to create a corridor of safety along the edge of the sanctuary's boundary. With the legal proceedings nearly finalized, there was talk of formal recognition, of protected land status, of public education campaigns and rehabilitation centers for wounded animals. Hope had started to take on a shape that felt real, tangible, but all of that fell away when the first gust of wind hit, fierce enough to scatter the blueprints from the table, hard enough to slam the barn door open with a wooden crack. The temperature dropped sharply, and Jacob knew. This wasn't just weather. This was going to be the kind of storm that tested more than structures. By the time he reached the ridge trail, the clouds were boiling in thick grays, and the first streak of lightning tore a jagged scar across the horizon. Rain followed fast, pelting the earth in sheets, turning dust to mud and washing loose stones down the slopes. He slipped twice on the trail, catching himself on roots and low brush, his shoulder flaring with pain from the jolt. But he kept moving. He wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the herd. If they were still navigating the upper canyon routes, the sudden downpour could be deadly. Steep paths would become slick. Rock faces could give way. The narrow chutes they used for shelter might flood. He had to know where they were, had to be sure they were safe. He reached the overlook after nearly an hour, soaked to the skin and gasping, boots caked with mud, eyes stinging from rain. Below, through the haze of water and wind, he saw movement, faint and fractured by the storm, but unmistakable. They were there. Not panicked, not running, but huddled close together in a shallow depression near the far end of the canyon wall. The scarred mare stood at the edge, her body braced against the wind, her head lifted, watching the skies. The younger horses clustered near a low rock outcrop that offered some protection. Even in the chaos, there was order. Even in the storm, there was still that quiet instinct guiding them. But Jacob saw what they couldn't. Higher up, past the narrow shelf they had taken refuge on, a section of cliff had started to crumble. The rain was carving it apart, water seeping into old cracks, turning solid stone into shifting sand. He could feel it in his bones, the way the earth gave underfoot, the vibration traveling through the ridge like a warning. If it gave way, the entire ledge could come down with it. He had no time to wait, no time to think about rules or caution or what made sense. He turned and ran, following the side trail that wound around the back of the canyon, slipping and sliding, every step a gamble against gravity. He reached the lower path just as the thunder cracked overhead like a gunshot. The trail narrowed to less than a meter across, skimming the edge of the drop. He pressed forward, wind battering him sideways, trees whipping back and forth like angry sentinels. At last, he saw them. The mare turned sharply at the sound of his approach, ears flat, hooves shifting in the mud. Jacob raised both hands slowly, breath ragged, not to stop her, but to warn her. Above them, the cliff gave a low, terrible groan, the sound of rock under strain. And then it started. A spray of pebbles first, then whole slabs of shale shearing off and tumbling downward. The Mustangs reacted instantly. The mare gave a sharp cry, and the herd turned, moving as one toward the eastern slope, the only way out. But the colt, the same young gray with the streaked mane and restless spirit, had frozen near the edge, too close to the danger. A boulder split free from the wall above and struck the ledge with a deafening crash, splintering it in two. Jacob didn't think. He lunged forward, dropping low, grabbing the foal's neck just as the ground beneath them tilted. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, he wasn't sure if they would both fall. But then, a scramble, a leap, mud flying beneath his boots, and they were clear. The colt stumbled free, hooves skidding before racing back toward the herd. Jacob lay flat in the mud, chest heaving, the taste of earth and fear thick in his throat. The rain had softened for a moment, the worst of the front having passed. He pushed himself up slowly, shoulder on fire, legs unsteady. The mare stood a few feet away, watching. She didn't move toward him, but she didn't turn away either. Her gaze lingered long enough that he could read the recognition in it. The herd regrouped on the far side, higher ground, safer ground. One by one, they disappeared into the rain, their silhouettes swallowed by mist. Back at the cabin, Rosa arrived just after dark, her truck coated in grime, her hair plastered to her face. She burst through the door, eyes wide. "We saw the slide from the ranger station. Thought you were up there. You okay?" Jacob, sitting by the fire, nodded once. "They made it," he said quietly. "All of them." She didn't ask how he knew. She just sat beside him, neither of them speaking for a long time. The storm had passed, but something else had solidified in its wake. Not just the survival of the herd, but the strength of the bond between those who understood the land and those who belonged to it. Not through ownership, not through law or force or fences, but through trust, through action, through the kind of unspoken loyalty that doesn't fade when tested. It sharpens, becomes absolute. That night, as the fire crackled and the storm winds faded into a low, distant murmur, Jacob opened his journal again. His fingers hesitated over the page, as if words might never fully capture what had happened. Then, slowly, he wrote, "Not everything wild needs saving. Sometimes it just needs someone to stand still long enough to see it." He closed the journal and set it aside. Outside, in the distance, a lone, clear whinny cut through the night air. Not distressed, not uncertain, just a sound to say, "We're still here, and we remember."